Imagine yourself under a starry sky, around the warm glow of a sacred fire, where speakers gather to share their wisdom and insights. Creating a sacred space where all are welcome to warm their hands, here are your hosts, Sarenth Odinson, Snow, Cabra, and Emily Streaking Fate. Discuss spirituality, mythology, animism, and culture around a virtual sacred fire. Won't you join us around Grandfather Fire?
The holy ones who enchant the world, who fill it with joy and challenge, who fill it with beauty and awe, who fill it with magic. Hail to the holy ones who are these things. Hail to the holy ones who bring it together. Hail to the holy ones who teach us these things, who bring them to our spirits, to our souls, to our bodies. Hail to the holy ones who weave spells, who carve fate. Hail to the holy ones who show us the ways that our spirits take flight. Hail to the holy ones who bring magic into every moment, who encourage us to find, to do, to cast, and retrieve. Hail to the holy ones who teach us, who encourage us to learn, teach us to revel. Hail to the blessed ones who are on every side of us, for us, behind us, above us, beside us. Oh, the blessed ones who walk with us. Oh, the blessed ones who have walked before us. Oh, the blessed ones who walk behind us. Hail to all the holy ones, the gods, the ancestors, the spirits, the mediators, the ones between, who make all things possible, who bless this world, who are this world. Show us the ways to enchant this world, to enchant ourselves, to walk in beauty and awe and love once again. Hail to you all. Estual. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Around Grandfather Fire. This is episode 123 with my good friends and co-hosts, Cabra, Snow, and Emily Streaking Fate. How are you all tonight?
I'm good. I was really enjoying that prayer, actually. And I like the mention of those who teach us, but also those who teach us to revel. I think that's an interesting sentiment. We don't always think about that kind of thing when thinking about teaching and learning. So I thought that was really cool. But yeah, no, I'm good. I'm all right. Been working on furthering my studying of geomancy lately, which has been really interesting and rewarding. It's kind of a divination system that I'm getting into. And then with some friends well, with the assistance of a friend who did some divination for me, have been exploring a new relationship with a newly revealed god, which I've been writing about a bit. So it's been good.
Cabra, how about you?
Um, I have been having the unwinteriest winter of like my last decade, where usually I hole up and don't do anything and don't talk to anybody from Thanksgiving until like March 21st. And this year, I don't know what happened, but I've been running a bunch of rituals and seeing people, and it's just been like my usual growing season sort of life. And I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I'm really happy to be doing things that I like and not to be feeling like I can't get off my couch most days, but also I think I need to be on my couch for a few months every year. So and the growing season is fast approaching, so the amount of opportunities I'm going to get to sit on my couch and be a potato are numbered.
Understood.
It's a good time of year for potatoes, though.
Right. Something you mentioned earlier, Snow, was about revelry, and I didn't connect this at the time because I was just
Hmm.
doing poetry. But it is a season of Mardi Gras, from what I understand, so that actually makes a lot of sense. Why that would be coming to the fore at the moment, and why enchantment with that in the air at the moment makes so much
Yeah.
sense to me.
That is true, and I believe our resident folk Catholic inspired sorcerer was talking about Carnival, and we've also just had the Chinese slash Vietnamese slash Mongolian slash South Korean slash, am I missing anything?
Lunar
New
New
Year.
Year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Emily, how about you?
I am tired but good. There has been a little bit of sickness going through the household. So that's increased a little bit what I need to do to help take care of things. Thankfully, my bout of sickness was shorter than some of the other household members, so that's been nice. Trying to deal with the weather being excessively warm and then cold and then warm again. I'm enjoying being able to go outside with like just a jacket and run around with the dog, but it also means more potential muddy paws and ticks. I kind of wish there was a little bit more time of cold snow because I really like walking through the forest in the snow. But those could be famous last words. So I am trying to enjoy it as it is, given that we have as much sun as we do. I know a lot of my family lives in Nebraska, and they had like a few days straight where there was absolutely no sun at all. So I'm grateful that we have the sunshine that we do, and for the ability to get outside without having to worry about being too cold for the dog or too cold for me. But yeah.
I do like being in the woods.
I love the woods. I didn't get down there as much as I would have liked to last year. And finding a time where it's like dry enough to do offerings and stuff in addition to just walking the woods, but it's such a peaceful and connective place. I say peaceful, like with the caveats of it is woods. So obviously, sometimes you find animal parts and such, but it's a really enjoyable experience. I'm very grateful to have woods so close to my home.
My partner and I also both really enjoy the woods, them more than me, but that's only because they walk into the woods and it's like everything falls away and you get a peek at their like true self for a minute, which is really beautiful. And we, because of the wedding last year and a couple other shenanigans, didn't get the ability to go hiking and camping as much as we would. So this year, the whole growing season theme is like, I want to grow the Three Sisters. They want to grow a perfume garden. And we are trying to make as much time for going hiking and camping as is humanly possible. So it'll hopefully be a good return to the forest year for the two of us.
I was just gonna echo Cabra too, with the fact that there's a lot going on this year as opposed to last year for me. And I knew that when the year changed over, it would be getting a lot busier, a lot faster. I am still working on trying to catch up with that. But I am enjoying the multitude of opportunities that keep popping up, and all of the conversations and ability to connect with different communities that I wasn't originally anticipating.
You do contain multitudes.
So would now be a good time to bring up my topic idea.
Yeah, in just a moment, actually. So the project that I'm working on, really quick, is the
Yes, how have you been, Saranth?
I've been busy
You're
as
here
hell.
too.
The Heathen Spirit Work, book 1 is at 90,009 words now, and it's almost done to where I can start looking at some of the articles that are sitting at the back and seeing if it works for the manuscript or not. So it either is sitting at 90,009 or 60,009, depending on whether or not these get included. Aside from that, lots and lots of overtime at work, whether I want it or not. I'm actually dreading going into work tonight because of how much overtime there is. And I've got buddies at work texting me, "Hey, if you can come in early, do so." And I'm like, I can't, champs. I got a podcast to record. So I'll be looking forward to that when I get in. The besides work stuff, besides the book, my Patreon is progressing apace. I'm really appreciating all the topics and the things that people have brought forward. The other thing that I'm working on is I'm in a Heathen Soul Lore class, and I'm working on that, which has been a lot of fun. It's interesting because the format for me is very different than how I understand the soul map, soul matrix, what have you. And so being able to directly talk with the author of Heathen Soul or Winifred Hodge Rose has been really cool because we get to compare and contrast in real time as opposed to me reading the book and reflecting. So that for me, like, when people ask, should you read a book versus go to a workshop? I'm like, if you can go to a workshop 9 inches out of 10, go to the workshop. And stuff like this is why, because the author is wonderful and has written an amazing amount of work. If you want to look at her stuff, go to heathensoullore.com. All one word. So that's one thing I'm doing. I'm also doing a trans class because why not? In addition to other studies. So that's what's going on with me. Is it's working really well with my schedule despite the immense amount of overtime, because I'm working about 3 to 4 a week right now. Oh, it's .net. Thank you for the correction. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. And I was just looking at my notes here really quick. Wanted to thank Jason for taking on editing duties, and sincerely from the bottom of my heart, thank you for doing that, because that's a good chunk of work that is off the plate of everybody here, which is nice. Thank you so much, Jason.
We love you, Jason.
We love you, Jason. May your coins be plentiful.
So Saranth, you mentioned your Patreon there was going apace and really helping. Would that be patreon.com/Saranth Odinson?
It would. I was gonna save it for plugging the pluggables, but yes, that would be where you go. So yeah, Cabra, if you wanted to introduce our topic for the evening, potentially our primary topic for the evening, depending on how this goes.
I mean, we'll see, right? So it has 2 sections. First is I'm going to come up with a concept and I'm going to describe it, and y'all are either going to go, yeah, I can see it, or you're going to be like, that's not a thing, which is fine. And that would be the end of it, theoretically. Or you're going to go, that is a thing, and then I get to move on to my hot take about the concept. So Max Weber describes a concept called the disenchantment. I think that he has some kind of highfalutin fancy definition for what that is. We're going to throw it in the garbage. When I say the disenchantment, what I mean is narratives, histories, and legends about how we got to where we are right now in the present day moment in our spaces, of this story where currently some kind of magic or spiritual good is missing from the world. There was a time where it existed, a disenchantment happened, and now there is some kind of imperative to restore it. So I've heard this narrative 5 or 6 different ways, right? There's the matriarchal goddess worshiping societies. We should totally bring those back. There's the like the really, really creepy Blavatsky Lemuria version of it. Then there's the Christians ruined polytheism and nature worship version. And then there's there's like a couple other versions of it, right? And so I guess the first question that I have is, do you think that grouping these together and calling them disenchantment narratives is useful? Which disenchantment narratives do you run into in your communities? And what are some of the pros and cons that you see about these narratives?
Okay, so if we're gonna dispense with Weber's definition and go straight to what disenchantment means, are we looking at a popular definition, or are we looking at something that we've come to understand?
I was probably aiming more for a personal understanding. I just grabbed the terminology out of Weber because I think that his version of disenchantment fits into this category. But the category that I'm thinking about is a little bit more expansive in some ways and a little bit more focused in others. So I guess what I'm asking about is like, is this something that resonates with each of you personally on some level, or is this a thing that I'm just seeing?
I mean, I know first spanner in the works. I know we've already said we're shelving Weber, but I just looked up Disenchantment, Max Weber, and it basically just says the rationalization and devaluation of religion in modern society. And I think that pretty much fits into what you're saying, and I think is very much something that we see in a lot of our communities. Because I mean, I think the way that we see pagans and modern polytheists and associated peoples looking at broader secular post-Christian society or broader Christian society and sort of looking longingly and dreaming about what once was is very much a sort of byproduct of that. And also looking at broader post-Christian or Christian society and feeling that disconnect.
I would agree with that summary. I find it interesting that when you look at the German, what it translates to, the Entzauberung is disenchantment, but it means literally demagication. Like the word connotes, excuse me, the breaking of a magic spell. What I find really interesting is, for our purposes, I think that these ideas work well enough for what we're talking about. They give us, at least they give us starting lanes to have the conversation to start with. One of the things I think that Weber talks about, and I'm reading the Encyclopedia Britannica summary here, but undesirable consequences of disenchantment can be attributed above all to the fact that science inadequately fills the vacuum left by the diminishment of religion. It may be able to clarify questions of values and morals, but it ultimately is incapable of answering them. I think this is where a great many stumbling blocks are found, especially because my area of study was psychology, in that the disenchantment has leached into even the philosophy of psychology, because psychology is so goddamn afraid of its own shadow at this point. And I mean that fully jokingly with both the big S and the little s. Because psychology's background is in philosophy and was much more oriented around woo topics, and in many ways leaned into it until the scientification. And I don't mean in terms of like the scientific method, I mean in terms of probably, maybe not even scientification is probably the word for it, but it is very much a disenchantment of psychology that you can see as soon as the radical behaviorists get a hold of it, where everything has to be quantified by the ones, the zeros, and the t-tests. And whatever is not quantified through the behavioral science rationale, the rationale of double-blind studies and things like that, it's not real anymore. So the real is only what we can quantify with our studies and our tests and what we can reproduce in the lab, which is not where any of us really live besides scientists conducting these studies.
And like this idea, this disenchantment is like something that can get applied a bunch of different ways, right? So like folk Catholic revival movements in the US, which is like a super weird thing to even think about as a Brazilian, is very much like we used to have little devotional things we would do, and then Protestantism demystified Christianity, right? Disenchanted Christianity, right? Or there's like there's like a really weird mix of trad caths being like they took the things out of Christianity, but there's also like perfectly legitimate, fine, like, you know, like not fashy Catholics who are also like the Counter Reformation was maybe not the best thing ever. And then there's also this thing about how much of this disenchantment is cultural, because
Vatican II was a mistake.
Huh? Oh God. The Vatican was a mistake. Vatican I, I'm canceling you. But yeah, there's also this thing about like how the disenchantment is different from culture to culture, because I was raised by a Brazilian mother. So when I went, I'm trying to learn to read tarot, my mother's reaction was to go, cool, can you read me? I want to be one of your first people that you practice with, right?
Oh, that's cool.
Because she had a tarot reader back in Brazil before she moved up here, right? So it's just a thing of like, the disenchantment looks different from different perspectives, but we keep circling the drain on a disenchantment narrative in a lot of different branches of paganism, New Age, and even esoteric or occult movements.
Mm-hmm. I think it's worth pointing out how much poetry Crowley brought back, where the Golden Dawn was very staid, very, we are in our robes, we are in our circles, we have our triangles, and we have our weapons. And this is all very above board, and we are very respectable members of society. Crowley kind of threw caution to the wind and said, fuck it, and brought direct deity possession in a big way, brought poetry and lived experiences back in a big way, where he kind of re-enchanted ceremonial magic. If Crowley has successfully, I think, done anything over the course of his career and the after effects, it is to re-enchant the study and expression of magic in a lot of forms.
I love that. Emily, you've been quiet. Are you pondering, or?
I was pondering a bit. I do think some of the disenchantment narrative is tied to an over idealization of the past. I think some of the disenchantment narrative feels very accurate in that as science became put on such a high pedestal that it almost became a religion of its own, or in some places probably has. We have downgraded in certain societies the more mystical aspects of religion. I think bringing up the cultural differences is a huge thing that a lot of us don't consider, Cabra. And I do think that there is some parts of enchantment that were or have been accessed in different ways in different cultures, but maybe not as publicized or as respected or as talked about in general because of how pedestalized science has become.
So I think that we're ready for part 2 of this hot take.
Excellent.
Follow me on this one. So this is going to be like a lot of hot takes, so it's going to take a minute to react to all of it, but I'm going to try and lay it out like brick by brick, okay? I think the thing that the Anglophone world specifically is reacting to when it comes to this constant rehashing of disenchantment narratives is specifically the industrialization and like scientific revolution of Western Europe and like other locations, right? Not exclusively Western Europe. And I think that actually this would have happened with or without global colonialism and with or without industrialization, because there's a medicine for these cultures in this disenchantment, which is that prior to this disenchantment, this age of like reason or enlightenment, right?
Huge heavy air quotes for those who aren't on the call with us.
Right? Yeah. I have really big feelings about calling it the age of reason. The age of reasons to steal things from other people, more like. But the thing that I think is the medicine in the middle of all of this is that I think it was actually a good idea to have spirituality and empirical reasoning pull away from each other. Like they're two twin siblings who finally hit adolescence and needed to be apart to fulfill their own identities a little bit. Or like a spagyric medicine, right? You pull the individual pieces apart and then refine them and then put them back together. And I think that what we are seeing happen is we're pulling back and saying things like, I can scientifically reason that the sun is the center of the solar system without having to consult the Bible, without having to consult the Pope. Like, I think that that was in fact a necessary medicine. But I also think that, again, going back to the spagyric metaphor, our work in this generation is to try and bring them back together and to say, well, if empirical data cannot be disproven by spiritual scripture, and in fact, spirituality must take its understanding of physical reality and spiritual principles from empirical data, right? Then how do we do spirituality? And I think that's part of the thing that's going on right now in the internet age, post-revival, is that we pulled the two apart, they got refined a little bit, and then they're coming back together. So I think that despite the fact that the split was set off by industrialization, which is like the results of like mass terrible colonization, I think that split would still have happened. It just would have looked way different because it seemed like it was a necessary medicine for the Western European mind at the time and for so many of their diaspora populations.
I would argue it was only necessary with regard to creedal scripture religions. And here's why. The Enlightenment made a lot of hay over, we are more enlightened than our ancestors, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, they're still using the humor system. What they are hitting on is a very particular form of thought and rationalization that is allowed, starting within academia and then branching out from there. And I think that what is often missed is that the indigenous ages of enlightenment happened thousands of years ago in a variety of forms that are particular to their culture and their ways of life. The disenchantment narrative is only necessary with regards to creedal religion because if you cannot trust the observation of your eyes, the input of your senses, which is at some points what the creedal religions were demanding of their followers, then the separation cuts to the core of you as a person. Because if what you're observing is that this plant is helpful, this plant is is medicine, this plant also has a spirit and will communicate with you. If the church is saying, ignore the evidence of your eyes, your ears, your taste, and all the rest of it, then there is a fundamental disconnect between your beingness as a person and the world around you. And that begins and must be resolved through those institutions because of the power they're wielding, not because of their inherent rightness or usefulness. At least that's my interpretation of this, because so many narratives that we encounter through an indigenous lens are like, yeah, we're not asking you to just take what we're saying on face value. We're asking you to logic through this, only to include that the logic that we're operating from includes all these other bits that the Western worldview that has been sanitized of its spirituality no longer has. The only reason that this, I can't recall the spirit, the S word you used, Cabra.
Sorry, spagyric.
Spagyric.
I may have nerded out a little bit.
So the pulling apart and then putting back together is only necessary if you do not originally see these as a united front. That that the refining process, the way that you approach matter and spirituality as opposing forces only makes sense from a worldview where these things are inherently opposed and have to be split apart and then put back together. I appreciate that your verbiage is like Western and all that, because it's true. I don't see this as an issue in the reason I'm saying all this is I'm reading a book called Indigenous Healing Psychology by Dr. Katz, which is an amazing book. I'm about 100 some odd pages in, and he really talks about how psychology and healing are a holistic thing. And I just don't see this disconnect in indigenous cultures that retain their Weltanschauung, their worldview. Sorry, I went on a bit of a ramble there.
But you see, that was my secret evil plan all along. I had this hot take in the shower a month or two ago, and I was like, this smells wrong. I know don't have the whole picture here. That's exactly why I brought my hot take to the table. I'm like, I'm glossing over something.
I mean, I suppose my big gripes with disenchantment discourse and the entire concept is, for me, it is rooted in dictatorial politics, what I perceive as a false dichotomy between science and religion, which I think far too many pagans and modern polytheists reinforce, and scriptural literalism. Because I know Saren said creedal religions. Even religions which have sacred scriptures or holy texts or such, where they encourage different interpretation, or they explicitly state parts of this are allegorical, or so on, they seem to have decidedly less of an issue here. Like in a recent post of my own, I mentioned the stanza in the Quran where it says parts of this book are literal and obvious, and parts of it aren't, and that's going to take some thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I know elsewhere in the Quran there are things saying, if you reckon contrary to what we've said here, then go test it and try and prove otherwise, and sort of things like that, which I think makes a significant difference. Because, I mean, just to kind of continue on this tangent momentarily, I think when people think about sort of the mainstream religions, plenty of people globally have heard of Sufism, That's a big mystical tradition that is very much religious, but also has made plenty of contributions historically to the development of science at the same time. I mean, the Arabic and the Islamic world gave us the number 0 as a concept, whereas the Greco-Romans were counting from 1, sort of things like that. And so, evidently, I mean, that's an example of sort of early medieval people not having an issue with what we in a primarily sort of post-Protestant world have this dichotomy of science and religion. I mean, plenty of ancient Greek philosophical systems would cover the gods and theology in their physics, and would cover physics in with the gods and theology. Like that to them is one and the same, because it's all the worlds and how the world works and all the rest of it. And so for me, when the big, I suppose, issue or where I disconnect with the disenchantment kind of narratives and conversations is that for me, it is very much that setting up of an opposition between science and religion, and then using sort of literal interpretations of the Bible to reinforce and justify it, and then having the sort of political figures in the history of Christianity kind of beating people over the head with it.
Well, that's well said, and a very, very excellent point. And I appreciate the correction because, yeah, it's not all creedal religions. It is a specifically post-Reformation Christianity that is a large part of the issue we're talking about here, I would say. So yeah, I appreciate the corrective. It's very well put.
For me, though, this does kind of reinforce every once in a while, I see people doing something that like irritates me, and I'm like, that's not a problem. I'm just irritated because I'm irritable. But every once in a while, I smell something and I'm like, there's something behind this. And it keeps coming back to this kind of like, this like ghost of like different forms of Christianity that are still hanging around in the air in some ways. So like everybody is super obsessed with Day of the Dead, and everyone leans into like the indigenous Mexican observation, right? Or I guess like the even like just the present day like Mexican observation of this. And then you go and you look at pictures of like how this day is celebrated in Poland, and there's candles all over the graveyard. They don't have the marigolds or the sugar skulls, but they have candles over the graveyard. And I'm like, are you looking in Mexico because your grandma's ghost from Poland is after you to make her some cabbage rolls? Like, and then the same thing to me kind of happens with what is it? Every once in a while, people will be like, they're very obsessed with mantras. They're like, I got these malas and I'm writing something, but they're not like seriously invested in Buddhism. And I'm like, is this your grandma's ghost telling you to pray the rosary, buddy? Obviously, some people do like actually convert to Buddhism and like take it very seriously and understand which lineage they're studying and all of this. But like, I think this to me is another one of those moments of like, are we having a weird moment of recognizing with our bodies, but maybe not, and our emotions, but maybe not with our minds? Like the Reformation did do some good things, like calling out that purgatory is a weird scam to get you to give them more money. But did we throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know? Or I had espresso after 4 p.m. on a Sunday and I'm just vibrating out of my skull. Also an option.
Out of your sugar skull.
I do think there is a definitely like threw the baby out with the bathwater thing. One of the biggest parts about the disenchantment narrative for me is that I feel people over idealize like their perception of the past, and they fail to recognize the different ways that enchantment stayed in, and the different ways, like maybe within their own traditions or within their own cultures or within their own heritage, that if you look a little closer, this thing that my grandma always did. Like there is magic in that. There is an enchantment in that. This way that they honored the spirit. Like I think I feel like the disenchantment narrative has, for lack of better wording, some colonial overtones in the noble savage narrative. Like that's what it makes me feel like a little bit. Not that, like, I do think that it is useful to look at how we idealize science and discount religion and not realize how they work together. It's like any big institution, if there's not checks and balances, it's going to run amok. And for like the church, the Christian church, at points in history, it has run kind of amok because it had the power and it used that power to not to like relieve itself of any external checks and balances. Science, when we put it on a huge pedestal and don't realize like it's continuously changing and growing because of the scientific method, they keep testing things. You come up with a hypothesis, like that's the point of science. But it's almost because people are looking for a place to put belief, they will hear something and assume, oh, then this must be the be all end all, and not realize this is what we've discovered so far. But it's like science is a continual work in progress, as is religion. And when you put the two together, you have something so great. But because of the power structures, people tend to focus on one or the other in the Western view, I think right now, is like more towards the trend than realizing that they can work really well when put together.
Claire just said, John Beckett just published a post on the topic of disenchantment and how it's not new. Quote from his post: writing in the 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer complained that once, quote, all this land was fulfilled of fairy, but, quote, now can no men see none elves mow, which I assume means people don't see elves anywhere anymore. My Middle English is sketchy at best. And I'm also sitting here, first off, I definitely want to say I appreciate the noble savage narrative. That's kind of like there's like a sibling of that somewhere in this disenchantment narrative, and I think that that's really astute for you to point it out. But I'm also thinking, like, I keep calling these two twins. I think they're triplets, right? I think that the secret third one is engineering, because science says we measured and this is what we found by measurement. Engineering says, cool, I'm going to see if I can build something with it that works. And then religion comes along and says, like, but what does it mean, right? So the scientist uses observation to say, well, concrete is more powerful and strong when you mix it with seawater out of limestone from this particular thing, because we tested a bunch of different guys. And the engineer says, cool, I'm going to build a really big bridge over this river. And then the religion person comes along and says, we should put the head of Janus on the bridge and have a dedication ceremony so that hopefully the bridge will stay up longer and we can like consecrate this weird crossing of a big freshwater body for like the community, right? Like it's almost triplets, maybe. I don't know.
I think the hypothetical you just gave kind of reinforces how they can all intertwine and connect, and the opposition between science and religion needn't exist and isn't the most beneficial thing. And I think also the focusing on one over the others is partly why we see so many beginners and newcomers coming in and saying, well, I can put my glass of wine down and say, Hail Zeus, but what's that gonna do? Like I just have a glass of wine sitting on a shelf. So what? Because they're so focused on that scientific side of things, as they've sort of understood science and not the religious side of things because it's downplayed or devalued or is trying to be rationalized away. And I think if we want to go the I think that's also how a lot of atheist materialism sneaks into our communities. Who wants to go next?
Oh, no, sure. So this is where my sticking point with work with as a narrative becomes a very big bugbear. Because I use work with in a very particular way. And it seems like, at least for a lot of beginners, the narrative of worship is so rooted in trauma that entertaining the idea of just leaving a glass of wine out for Zeus on its own merits is not considered. And part of the problem with disenchantment is that you're asked to reify everything in terms of usefulness. And because this disenchantment came with atheistic humanism as baggage, everything is put through that lens of what does it do for us humans? It is very anthropocentric and does not consider that these spirits might have their own reasons for you leaving that glass of wine out that has nothing to do with them drinking it. And part of that is because we don't have a lot of adequate underpinning of philosophical or religious education in our communities, because access to those institutions is really hard or expensive or both. The number one that I can think of here in America with Cherry Hill Seminary is not, what is the word? Where you're accepted by institutions.
Accredited.
Thank you. Because Cherry Hill isn't accredited, but it certainly speaks well of itself. The problem comes into getting access to institutions that can then make impact on a larger scale. So the problem becomes attached to a philosophical, religious, and political underpinning, which reinforces the conditions we're already seeing in our community and prevents us from moving forward past a point until we exert enormous effort to do so. And I'm not saying everybody throw your support behind Cherry Hill, but it is one example among many of how the inertia in our communities works against itself, if that makes sense.
I was just gonna say, I think that a piece that people tend to forget, from my perspective, I practice my religion and my spiritual practices because it makes my life better and it helps me contribute in a positive way to the community. And I see science, the benefit of science. We pursue science because it helps increase our understanding and make our lives better. Especially with you bringing in engineering, Cabra, we pursue engineering to develop things that help make our lives better. And like all of these things in my mind have the same goal to make our lives and our communities better. It's just they do those things in different ways. Like with setting out the glass of wine for Zeus, it's that cultivating the relationship with a deity as a way to help make our lives better. Just like cultivating relationships with our families, be it blood family or chosen family or adopted family. Like when we cultivate those relationships with our friends, we cultivate relationships that make our lives better. And I think that is a perspective that I think might get lost in the disenchantment narrative. Like science, with science and religion, they're not going for two different goals. They both are for the improvement of the quality of our lives and the lives of our communities.
Okay, so I think that there can be like a third branch kicker to this one, since we've already kind of gone over the first two parts. One of the things that I have noticed is that right-wingers love disenchantment narratives. They love them, right? And so the question then becomes, when we're sitting here doing revival stuff, right? Like I read a lot of medieval grimoires, so I also draw from the past. And we're doing this sort of like, well, back in college, all the frat boys used to worship demons and summon them to help them pass their tests, right? Like when you're faced with this particular thing, how do you disrupt the disenchantment narrative, and what's a better history, right? What is a way of looking at the, we used to do this and now we don't, but I think we should bring it back. And what is the good to be gained from this? And like, is there a way to disrupt this narrative and replace it with something that's like less co-optable by conservative viewpoint? Or is it just that a little disenchantment narrative is fine? It's just when you heap piles and piles and piles and piles of it on, you're left with coffee in your sugar instead of sugar in your coffee.
You can have a little disenchantment as a treat.
Yeah.
I think, well, the insidious part about right and left-wing narratives is because of how they exist in the modern times, they are consistently adapting themselves to whatever is in the cultural milieu by necessity. I think that especially because we're concerned about, hard right people coming in and toxifying spaces that we have made accessible for ourselves. I think that this is a danger no matter what area you're looking in, because this is a big problem in the hard atheist community as well. See Jordan Peterson, see and point at any of the new atheist movement, Dawkins or Hitchens or whomever. They are very easy to co-opt. It doesn't matter what community you're coming out of. You are not immune to propaganda. That being said, I don't think that we actually need the disenchantment narrative as a curative for this. I think that part of the beauty and the depth of polytheism and animism is that it has space for all viewpoints, including ones that I find incredibly horrid and toxic. Because if I do believe in a polyvalent polytheism, that is, there are many truths from many different points of view, that I cannot just out of hand say, well, the gods never listen to these people. I have to accept that there is probably something listening to them and interacting with them. Okay, so how do I make a situation where these are less tenable ideas? I make my religion more appealing. I make my philosophy and the way I do things more appealing. I also, at the same time as I make them more appealing, I make them richer and deeper, because part of the issue with a lot of these right narratives is once you dig beneath the surface, there's not a whole lot there, because it's mostly just rhetoric keeping that community together. It's just that they're very loud. Now, this is also, I will say, a problem on the left, because I hear all these cries for mutual aid, mutual aid, mutual aid, and fuck all comes of it. Besides maybe a GoFundMe, which, not shaming GoFundMes, those are definitely needed. I have contributed to many a mutual aid. The problem is that's where the conversation stops, because what we're not seeing is investment in community. And part of that is, once you get past the door, what's keeping people there? And that is where I think having a philosophy and a religion which can accurately and usefully describe why you're setting down a glass of wine for Zeus is so important, because people are going to either leave, or they're going to half-ass it, or they're going to stick around for the vibes. There's nothing wrong with sticking around for the vibes, but that is not a viable community in the long term. So what I think, as we explore this disenchantment narrative, one of the key factors that we are looking at is the loss of communal identity and communal belonging. And I think that is where a lot of polytheisms have strength and power, just not in terms of numbers. There is a richness and a depth to animism and polytheism as religious understandings that allows, by their nature, to re-enchant the world. Because once you posit there are gods and there are spirits, the enchantment of the world becomes obvious. Once you accept this as a premise, the disenchantment narrative completely falls apart. But you have to actually accept as opposed to play acting or supposing. You actually have to live as if. And if you don't have like total faith, that's not what I'm saying here. I am not saying perfect faith or perfect trust or any of that other stuff. But by positing that there even might be a god or gods, and that there might be spirit or spirits, if you follow this logic train and live as though, and then live this idea, the disenchantment narrative will fall apart. And one of the things that I find our communities really need to do is provide this supportive atmosphere. Some of it's validation and some of it is discernment, which is where I'm seeing a lot of modern polytheist discourse go, which I'm happy to see. I'm also seeing this in folk Catholic discourse as well, from the little bit that I see online, where, people are starting to be able to discern, is that St. Anthony, is that St. Joe, and which St. Joseph are we talking about? But more to the point, I think where we are finding ourselves is that in taking off the disenchantment, which has up to this point for a lot of people been a necessary security blanket, we have to make sure that there's actually something there for people to grab hold of. And this is where I think a lot of polytheist groups and religions really fall down, because they've operated on vibes and freedom, and big air quotes around that freedom, by the way, that there's no cogent narrative around which to build your life. Because if you're going to dismiss disenchantment, something else for that vacuum needs to be there, if that makes any sense. Am I just like talking up my ass here? Am I making sense?
No, I mean, it makes sense. What I'm hearing you say, right, at the tail end of this series of very wonderful comments is that moving away from disenchantment narratives is partially a matter of practice and also like depth of relationship experience and philosophy. But you can't just take somebody who's very invested into a shallow disenchantment narrative and hanging on for dear life and not at least offer them a pair of pool floaties to let go of the life raft they're currently clinging on to. And I mean, this is, at least I might be projecting one of my own beliefs onto you, but that's what I'm hearing you say. And listening to you.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay. Awesome. But the other thing that I was thinking about is one of the ways that I think I deal with the disenchantment narrative in my own practice is to say that things come in cycles. It's not that this is a thing that has happened once. It's that this is a thing that comes and goes, right? Like, it is very much known that when large economic systems begin to collapse, at least throughout the history of the Mediterranean and Western Europe, right? I can't speak for the rest of the world. The middle class, especially the middle class that are at risk of losing their middle class status, have a tendency to fall into like really weird religious practices. It's like, once you have, it's all the people in history who have just enough power to do fun things, but nothing to gain by being on the straight and narrow, are always the people who go find like some spicy religion to do. And I think we see that, and Snow, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's also partially where we see like the rise and fall of mystery cults at different points in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, is that they become particularly popular around people who have enough disposable value to engage in one of these mystery cults, but no ladder to climb with that disposable or dispensable value or monetary holding. So it's like, I think we've done this before.
I mean, things definitely go in cycles. I mean, there were definitely elements of that with various mystery cults at different times across the Greco-Roman world and the Greco-Egyptian world. But then at the same time, you also see mystery cults who were very accepting and inclusive, regardless of economic status or political status or ethnic, cultural, linguistic background. And that actually ties into something that I was thinking about as we were starting this conversation, when we were first talking about sort of how we're perceiving disenchantment, which is that this separation between sort of the everyday, the mundane, and then the magical has pretty much always been around. And I would even go so far as to say is also fairly global and international. Like, even if we were to look at indigenous cultures, not everyone is a spirit worker, and not everyone is thinking about dealing with spirits or spirit workers. The vast majority of people in human history are getting up to go to work, to come home, to spend time with family, to go to bed. It's kind of those with, I mean, often it's those with education and the ability to have the time to sit around pondering what the gods reckon, who are kind of doing that. But I mean, that divide between sort of where we say exoteric and esoteric, the sort of the obvious and the hidden, or the very forefront and the obscured, has pretty much always been around. And so in the ancient Hellenistic world, the ancient Egyptian world, the ancient Roman world, you put out your glass of wine for Zeus because it's the done thing. Like, those are the religious rites everyone does. Why wouldn't you do them? It's obvious. But like, why are you questioning it? Just crack on. But then the esoteric thing is when you get into kind of the deep, um, allegorical, metaphorical, mystical, magical reasonings behind it, what things symbolize, what things connect to, which is where you can get different explanations and different frameworks as to what the offering of the wine to Zeus means and signifies and so on. But not everyone necessarily had the time or the inclination to think that far about it. Which also ties into another point I thought of as Sarenth was talking just now, which is that post-Protestant Reformation Christianity very much said belief is adequate. You don't have to do anything, belief is enough, which is very much something we see in our pagan and polytheistic communities now, where people say, well, I believe in these gods, or I believe that what Crowley wrote in this book is great, or I believe in the god and goddess in this Wiccan framework or whatever, and that's enough. Why should I bother doing anything else? I don't have to do anything else. It's not going to do anything. And that's a very Protestant Christian mindset that you're then dragging into a very non-Christian thing. And also that is, again, where this kind of scientific atheist materialism is kind of creeping in, where you're going, well, I could do this act or that act or this act, but then what's that actually doing? Because people aren't, they're either not inclined or they're not able or they're not encouraged to think about those things and the whys and the hows and the what fors. And so people think, and so then that kind of clicks in there.
You raise a really good point because the deeds not belief thing is a huge undercurrent that underpins my spirituality from my Catholic background. It's completely at odds with where a lot of folks come from, whether it's the pagan community or the larger Christian community here in America, where I'm like, okay, you say you believe these things, and why does that not call you to action? It was something that I was bashing, especially when I first began blogging. It was something I was smacking my head against like a brick wall really hard when I first became a pagan, because I'd have all these people around me who would tell me, "Well, I believe this." I'm like, "Great, and now what?" And they just look at me like I had a hole in my head, and I'm like, "No, like, okay, so you believe these things. Now what?" Like, there's a thought process to follow here, and it's a thought stopper. Well, I
Right.
believe.
I mean, it's one of those things where I am fairly sympathetic towards it because for a lot of these people, they've never had anyone go, so what? They've never had reason to go, and how does that impact your day to day? They've had no reason to go, okay, and then what's the physical side of this? What's the practice here? Because they're coming from backgrounds where you go to church on Sunday, so you all sit in a room and talk about how great God is, and then crack on, get on with the rest of your week. And that disconnect because they're working with a system where belief is adequate. And so, I mean, in the sort of circles that I run in, you see a lot of philosophical conversations and so on, and people kind of going, okay, so what? And having that, okay, so what, can be really helpful. Like, I know myself, having gotten into things like Stoicism and Hermeticism, a lot of that can be contemplation or meditation or thinking, but then it's working out how to apply that in your daily life so that it's for something and there is an end there and it becomes practicable and applicable. Because otherwise, if you are just chin stroking, it's kind of what are the gains here? Um, and like we're not sitting around getting point increases on our stats for the end game because we believed really hard, and belief is a
Is there something else I can help with?
no, Siri, shut up. Um, yes, Siri, could you help us with the pagan community? Okay, someone else talk.
I do think that you have to ask yourself what you're looking to get. Like for some people, belief is what they have the energy for. And I would even say that, and I come from a Catholic background, if you go to Mass every Sunday, that's a devotional act. There's some work put into that. Thinking about your beliefs and how they apply to your values and your life decisions, I think is an extra level in addition to just straight believing that the gods and spirits exist. But you can believe that the gods and spirits exist and not want to have anything to do with them. So then maybe it's not going to influence how you go about things. But if you are looking to get more out of your spirituality than simply feeling good, I think looking at how your beliefs are affecting your life and how you could put in work in different areas, whether that's volunteering for an organization that maybe your patron deity would be all about, or maybe that's talking to an elderly neighbor or a relative and like building your like own bonds with people. There's all kinds of different ways of doing different types of work. And I think it was a really good point that not everybody is a spirit worker. Not everybody has the time or the resources to be a spirit worker, which why historically there's like a few priests or a few spirit workers, or like there's different roles. Even when in communities where maybe there's a priest, there also might be someone that makes ritual items. And so, there's people that fill these different roles. Nobody does all of the things because nobody has the internal or external resources to be able to do all of the things. It is a communal effort. And I think it's important for people to look at what roles what resonate with them. How can they best improve their life by like leaning into the faith, whatever their faith is, if that makes sense. Kind of rambling
does.
now.
This is wild to me, by the way, having been raised interfaith, because I've run into that thing where you walk up to people in pagan spaces and you're like, so what's your practice like? And they just like kind of look at you. And it hadn't occurred to me that part of the reason people do that is because I'm asking them about their actions and not their beliefs. Or if I walk up and I'm like, what spirits or deities you have relationships with? I'm asking the word relationship and they just kind of look at me for a minute. I just look at them back and I wait. It's delightful. But for me, having come from a little bit of an oddball background, raised in an interfaith house, as soon as I was like, I think I'm going to try this religion next, the next question that comes to my head is, what holidays do I get if I join your religion? Like, that is the next thing, because that's where the layperson runs into the religion most often. It's like, okay, well, hold up. If I become a Discordian, what are my holy days of obligation and what do I do? It's like, okay, corn dog on Friday. Is there like a yearly get together of like April Fool's Day? Okay, I'm liking this. Tell me more, right? So that's an interesting difference of realizing that the way I was raised is a little different, just to be like, oh, of course, the first obvious question when you join a religion is, what holidays do I get to ask my boss to let me have off of work? And like, which is the getting drunk holiday? Because if your religion doesn't have a getting drunk holiday, I'm not interested. I need at least one.
I mean, I think that also touches on why we see so many newcomers and beginners struggle so much with holidays, because so many newcomers and beginners are solitary practitioners. And given, I mean, we've been one of the many undercurrents throughout this entire conversation has been community, and the having the conversations, having the community, communicating, that kind of interdependence, being able to go to different people for different roles because not everyone can do everything, and trying will kill you. Stop it, Sarenth. Um, and so newcomers and beginners have this thing with holidays because it's kind of, oh, well, this is the one day of the year. I suppose I really have to do something, and belief isn't enough on its own. And because often, if you're coming from something like Christianity or even just a post-Christian kind of secular region, then something like Christmas is like a big highlight on the calendar, whether you're particularly devout or religious or not. And so they're kind of looking for the equivalence there. But if you are a solitary practitioner, then it gets really, really hard because you're kind of doing the communal thing as a community of one. And so then it's kind of working out how to navigate that, which I think is also why so many end up giving up the notion of holidays, because it's kind of like, well, if I'm doing ritual just for me, then that date there in that month, 6 months away, isn't really all that different to what I'm going to be doing Thursday morning before work. So, do I need the holiday at that point? And those are the kinds of things that I see a lot.
I think also we're seeing a disconnect, not just in terms of solitaries, but also for those of us who do have groups, the calendar may not make any kind of sense for our local habitat at all. Like, I'm thinking of folks who only have 2 seasons, dry and wet, and how you really have to adapt the heathen, the generally speaking, when people say the heathen calendar, they're thinking the Icelandic. Uh, how you have to adapt that to your local conditions, and unless you're willing to put that work in, the holiday calendar doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense unless you're going to really abstract what these holidays mean. Um, some of them are incredibly hyper local, and that's fine. I think part of where I'm seeing heathenry and paganism in general is much more willingness to look around us as opposed to just, well, I'm going to default to the wheel of the year. Or if I am defaulting to the wheel of the year, it's much more informed by local conditions now than it used to be when I came into the community, which has been really neat to see, because to my mind, it kind of reconnects a place where people were previously disconnected, if that makes sense.
I think one of the benefits about having as much online access and ability to communicate virtually with people all around the world is for elders in the community, just pagans in general, to be able to be a little bit more transparent about how they go about the day-to-day of their practice. Because I do think for solitary practitioners and for people new to the communities, there is this idea that they have to do everything a certain way. And for certain traditions, that might be the case. But for other traditions, there's a lot more flexibility, and growing your practice and figuring out what works for you is a process that most, if not all of us, go through. And I have found it so helpful being able to see how so many different people do things differently and figure out ideas of how certain things would work for me and work in my practice. I tend to cycle through periods where I am all about ritual as one, like just by myself for holidays, versus I'll celebrate holidays, but just in group ritual, because I do love ritual. But sometimes for me, like it is, if I'm by myself, it does feel like just another day. So if that happens to be, if I'm going through a cycle and that happens to be the case, then I just try to take a bit more care and attention of, okay, I might not be up for throwing a party for my spirits on this day, but I am still going to go down to the forest at least once every 2 weeks with my offerings and spend some time talking to those spirits there. Because that is a way that I build the relationships in my practice. And I think that it is an incredible gift in this day and age that we can see how many different ways we can build our practices and get ideas for what might work for us.
Do we want to maybe wrap up with final thoughts on, I know we started talking about disenchantment and then somehow we wound up in this faith versus works place, which was really juicy. But yeah, do we maybe want to do a round of like final thoughts for the episode?
So I think that the disenchantment narrative and the works versus faith thing actually works really well together as a topic, because part of the disenchantment narrative is almost the antithesis of belief is enough. Because if I just disbelieve, I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to do anything. It almost becomes this way of living vicariously. And part of the power and the challenge of re-enchantment is that not only is there more to this world than mere physics or mere insert word here, now there's things out there you can develop relationships with that have pull and obligation and can ask you to do things or demand you do things. And how are you going to live your life in response to that? For me, the power and the beauty of stepping away from disenchantment and embracing enchantment is radical responsibility on the one hand and interdependence on the other.
I would say, again, one of my biggest issues with the disenchantment theory is I think it over idealizes the past. And I would say the other big issue that I have with it is that I think it takes away the option of people in the present day to bring enchantment in. Like Sarenth said, it takes away the benefit of works. It like obvious, it's the idea of, well, I can't, it doesn't matter what I do, it won't change anything because everything was disenchanted already. And so I think it takes away the responsibility, but also the opportunity for people to bring science and religion and engineering together and like have a more cohesive life, in my perspective.
Yeah, I think for me it is that cohesion, it is that holistic view. I think encouraging people to stop subscribing to these binaries and these poles of science and religion and putting them together. I'm sort of reminded of how Einstein said space and time aren't two separate things, it's space-time. And so he started writing space-time. And I think that kind of mentality and approach is kind of how we should view things like this. I think that, I mean, belief is a wonderful thing. Belief is good. Belief can give hope, and belief can bring comfort, and belief can be very grounding. But then practice helps, and it is all very well and good to have curiosity in your practice, and having a practice of curiosity is very good and helpful. And staying curious as you're practicing then informs belief, and then your belief then informs your practice. And it's that interwoven connection there that I think is the important thing.
I don't really have thoughts. I'm just really grateful that everybody was willing to come with me on this little journey where my shower thought turned into an hour and a half. And I'm like definitely going to be sitting here chewing on a lot of these ideas for like months to come. So I want to say thanks again for letting me bring my hot take shower thought to the episode.
I appreciate you inviting us into your shower for an hour and a half. It has been fun showering with you.
Are your fingers pruny yet, Snow?
I'm melting.
Oh, my water bill's going to be through the roof.
All right, beautiful people, plug your pluggables. Cabra, since you started us off, where can people find you?
steelcitywitch.com. There's a link on the page to my YouTube channel. I have been making abundant use of the beautiful microphone that I have now to record more things. I have a blog post that I just put up on my WordPress. And I think that's mostly it.
How about you, Snow?
You can find me at linktree/snowthegoth because I changed my username on a whole bunch of platforms because it is decidedly easier to say and write, and I stopped using the name that I was using ages ago for various reasons. So linktr.ee linktree/snowthegoth, and then everything is there. And I have recently been blogging about my recently revealed goddess I've been worshipping and forming a relationship with. Recently did a blog post on teachers and students, and recently reblogged a post from a friend on magic and viewing magic, and it's all fun, interesting things.
All right.
For me, streakingfate.wordpress.com.
All right, and you can find me at sarenth.wordpress.com. You can find me at patreon.com/Sarenth Odinson. You can also hit our live shows for 3 Pagans on Tap, and that's usually the first Tuesday of the month. Lately, we've been at 9 o'clock. We're going to be switching probably to about 11 because work schedules are a thing, and Maleck's schedule has gone topsy-turvy yet again. So keep an eye on our space, and we will let you folks know when the next episode for that is. For anybody that wants to support the show, please go to our Patreon, patreon.com/aroundgrandfatherfire. If you cannot financially contribute, please, and even if you are financially contributing, please leave us positive 5-star golden reviews on any platforms that you can find us. Apple Music is really good for that, but so is also Spotify. I use Podcast Addict, and it also shuffles the podcast data like that to the front. So if you could help us out with that as well to support the show. Also, please, if you have not yet, join the Discord. You can find that on the anchor.fm site, or you can find it through our Spotify. Please take care of each other. Be good to each other. And take care as you go through your day. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Thank you for Cabra, thank you so much for this topic. This was a lot of fun to dig into. And I want to thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time